Well, hello, and thank you for clicking on this video. I wanted to talk about how my ultralight gear changes when going from a 3-season setup to a winter season setup. 3 seasons could mean different things in different places. I'm talking about basically the Ozarks, which covers anything from maybe freezing on up to summertime temperatures. That's the 3-season setup. That was detailed in my other gear video. But as we go into November, December, January, February, things change. And temperatures can definitely get down into even the single digits here. We may not necessarily get a lot of snow, but if you want to go out into the woods in cold temperatures, you're going to need some different equipment. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Right off the bat, the change in weight that I have to carry is about 4.4 pounds. So if my 3-season base weight is 10 to 12 pounds, my winter base weight is going to be 14 to 16 pounds. That's definitely heavier, but there are some pieces of gear that I'll show later that will help explain why it is that way. One of the main pieces of gear that I would change, first of all, is my 3-season setup. I'm using a Hyperlight mountain gear flat tarp, the 8 foot by 10 foot. Well, in the winter, you get a lot more exposure to the cold and the wind and potentially precipitation. And so it's nice to have all 4 sides covered, or in this case, 6, 8, 10. This is a tarp tent Stratospire Li or Li or lithium. And this is a very lightweight tent. It's technically a 2-person tent, but it's actually really nice for 1 person in any use case, but definitely for the winter. As you can see, there's full coverage all around and a lot of stakeout points. And the shape itself can shed wind and water and even snow. On the inside, right now, I do not have the inner setup. So in a winter situation, this might be exactly how I would use it. It's basically a large, protected area. Inside there, I can set up my sleeping pads, my sleeping bag, and everything else. If I need to, I can open one of these vestibules and do my cooking right here, safely away from the Dyneema, of course. Now, like I mentioned, this tent does come with an inner, and I think that all comes down to whether or not I feel the need for bug protection in winter. And it's true that there are not a lot of flying insects, but things like large wolf spiders and things like that are still out in the winter. And I think it's just going to come down to, on that particular trip, whether or not I'm feeling comfortable from them. I wouldn't say I'm afraid per se, but I mean, who among us really wants to wake up with one of those things crawling across us? So that's the change that I would make to my shelter. Well, another change I would make going into the winter season is to move away from a canister type stove to a liquid fuel type stove that you saw featured in the beginning of the video. And most people know this, but it's worth saying that the fuel in canisters is a set pressure from the factory, and then as you use the fuel, the total pressure decreases. And if it gets cold enough outside with ambient temperatures, you can get into a situation where all of that fuel inside the canister is essentially in the liquid phase, and it won't come out, and therefore you won't be able to run a stove like this. There are things you can do. You can sleep with that canister inside your sleeping bag or put it inside your coat, but that's not particularly reliable or convenient. So what I like to do instead is to use this MSR Whisper Light, This is the international version, but you can put liquid fuel in the canister here. You control the pressure with the pump, and then you can operate this stove essentially in any temperature I would assume that a person would want to be in, at least. There may be colder temperatures where this won't operate, but I doubt that I'm going to be in the woods. And so this is for certain, it's heavier, but it's also very reliable, and that can be important when you want to have your hot meal or your hot drink, or even just unfreeze your water inside your water bottles or something like that. So there's a little bit of a survival aspect as well to this. Now, the next important change I'll make for winter is my sleep situation. These are some very thin silk leggings that I'll use normally. In the winter time, it's important to have a good base layer when you're sleeping, so I'll graduate to a 250 weight merino legging. Now, because the properties of this Patagonia top are so good, I use these in 3-season. I use this in 3-season, but I'll also keep it for winter because it is so warm. It has a hood, it's very lofty, and it's very lightweight. So these together make for an excellent warm sleeping situation. What am I sleeping on top of? Well, I like my thermarest for sure, but the R value there is approximately 3. I think the actual numbers changed in 2018 because of the testing standard, but in my head 3 is, in the old testing standard, good for maybe down to about 35 or 30 depending, and you start needing to look at 4 or 5 if you're going into temperatures below that. So what I'll do is I'll add in a Thermarest Ridge Rest, which is closed cell foam, and this one I've cut more or less to match the shape of this. It's sort of wider at the shoulders and tapers down, kind of a mummy shape, so that saves weight. And it's true that you could buy a Neo Air X-Therm, which would have sufficient warmth all in one for not that much more weight than this Thermarest. But the difference is I still like to have something that can handle a little bit of roughness. So if I take a break and I want to sit down, especially in the winter, I don't want to sit down on a cold, wet, and or snowy ground. So having a nice R value of 2 in the foam is great for utilitarian purposes. And then you put these together, you have an R value of 5. You can sleep to some very, very cold temperatures. And there's a little bit of a survival safety aspect, which is that if you ever have a puncture or a leak in this pad in cold situations, it's true that this alone would not really be enough to sleep well, but it will keep you from getting too hypothermic or something like that. It's nice to have a little bit of backup redundancy. It's important to note that the shelter that I mentioned, you really should not look at your shelter as some sort of protection from the cold itself. It's true that it will protect you from the convective effects of wind, and it will protect you from moisture and things like that. But in the dead of night, when it's 7 degrees outside, there's very little difference between the interior and exterior temperature, if any at all. And that would mostly just be due to the fact that you're inside the tent. But the tent itself, you really should not look at that as something that has any sort of insulative or warming properties, which is why you see all of this clothing on the table here, and what you don't see is a very large 10-degree down sleeping bag. But I'll show that in a moment. So now that we know what we're sleeping in and sleeping on, what are we going to do if we are hiking around? Well, I like to move away from the thin, lightweight wicking pants to soft shell style pants. These have a tighter weave, so they block some, or actually I would say a lot of wind from carrying away your heat. That's an important distinction. And another thing is they have a DWR, so they're slightly water repellent. And that can be good for walking around in the snow or light rain. These are just basically a way to help protect yourself from immediate sort of hypothermia, which you would get out of these, because these get wet very quickly, and in the summer they dry quickly, but not in the colder temps and higher humidity of the winter. So I migrate to these soft shells for walking. Another thing is I'll keep my sun hoodie. That's a good layer, but what I'll add is this is a 100 or 150 weight, depending on how you want to call it, fleece. This is in particular the Arc'teryx Delta LT hoodie. Everything that I have has a hood for the winter. I don't really like a hat so much. Hoods are good because they keep that area between your head and your neck encased, and I think it's just a lot warmer. So this is great for, usually you don't need much at all when you're hiking, but for warmth. But if it does get down to 15 or 20 degrees, maybe even 30 degrees, and you're walking around, unless you're really exerting yourself, you're going to get cold. So this fleece layer is really nice for that. But an important distinction is that it's a grid fleece, and it's thin enough, a low weight enough, that you can get a lot of sweat and vapor, water vapor, away from your body. So again, breathable, very important. Warm but breathable. And if it did get a little wet, maybe under the armpits or something, that's not great, but you can dry this synthetic material off way better than anything else. So I might be hiking with both of these, or I may put this on top of my pack if I'm stopping. And it'd have to be really cold for me to hike with gloves, but these are some possum down gloves, and I might do that if need be. Then the other important thing is the exterior layers. So my 3-season setup is this Arc'teryx Cerium, which is a very, very lightweight, but still very warm, packable down hoodie jacket. Well, that's not going to cut it in the winter, so I moved to this, I think it's out of production, but it's a Sierra Designs parka. Has a lot more down, a lot more loft, as you can see, and the cut is lower. So this comes down well below the waistline, and it makes a good seal. Oftentimes, the break between the jacket and the pants can leave an area where heat is lost. And then additionally, I'll have these down pants. So the parka and the pants are for any type of situation where basically I'm at camp and I'm not exerting myself. I'm not generating enough body heat, but it's also not time to sleep and get into the sleeping bag. Speaking of which, this is also actually part of the sleep system. These are some down booties, very lofty and pretty warm. These are an Amazon special, so there are probably higher quality, more effective ones, but these make a big difference for me because for whatever reason, when I'm sleeping, my feet just don't seem to circulate quite as well as the rest of my body, and this helps counteract that. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, during the 3 seasons I might use my quilt. This is good down to, I would say, roughly 35 degrees or so, maybe a little lower, assuming that I've got proper base layers and proper sleeping pad insulation. It's lightweight and it's packable. But if temperatures get colder, I'm going to move to this nice Western Mountaineering Ultralight. This is roughly a 10-degree bag. I should say it's labeled exactly as a 10-degree bag. And I would agree with that. I've used it down that far. An important distinction between a quilt and a sleeping bag is that a quilt is essentially like a blanket. And so even if you put this hem underneath you, it's not really a perfect seal. But something that this sleeping bag has is several important barriers to wind. So you have an overall external cinch around the head. You have an interior collar that you can also cinch. And running along the interior, along here, this is not only a zipper, but this baffle continues all the way along, all the way down to the end of the zipper. So that way, once you're inside this bag and cinched up, you essentially have a perfectly sealed cocoon. And that makes a big difference in terms of heat convecting out or away from yourself in the middle of the night. So all told, there's a number of changes that I would make going from a 3-season setup to a winter setup. It's worth noting that because I'm in the Ozarks, we aren't going to be dealing with feet of snow or mountainous conditions with high winds, ice, things like that. That would definitely be outside my area of expertise. But what I can say is that the gear that I've shown today I have used with a lot of success in this area, definitely down to single digits. Now, whether or not being out in single digits overall is a fun experience is, debatable. Not everyone's cup of tea, but for me, I really enjoy being able to sleep, eat, walk, and essentially survive and potentially thrive in those situations, depending on how you look at it. It's nice to build a huge fire. It's nice to enjoy the quiet. It's nice to enjoy the lack of crowds or people or anything like that. So this gear is very effective at what it's supposed to do, and it does come at a weight cost, like I said, about 4.4 pounds above my normal base weight. The other thing is that it's I won't need rain gear. So some of these changes are not all in addition. Sometimes we can take some of this bulk away. So I don't bring a rain kilt, I don't bring a rain jacket. But on the other hand, I have to bring more food generally because the body itself needs more calories. A lot of the insulation there is effective, but it's only there trapping your own body heat. So the biggest piece of advice I can give you is, yes, have the right gear, but also make sure you have enough energy. Make sure you have a good sleeping bag, make sure you have a good sleeping pad, and make sure you have a sufficient shelter. If you do those things, you'll be able to take care of yourself and enjoy it and be safe and be happy. So I would love to know what you all think. What do you bring if you camp in the winter or backpack in the winter? What would you do differently? Once again, thanks for clicking on this video. I appreciate it. If you appreciate it, consider subscribing and let me know what else you'd like to see.